Richard Dawkins, a prominent atheist and evolutionary scientist, once said, "It is absolutely safe to say that if you meet someone who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane. Or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that. If that gives you offense, I'm sorry, you're probably not stupid, insane, or wicked, and ignorance is no crime in a country with strong local traditions of interference and the freedom of biology educators to teach the central theorem of their subject." This quote by Darwin was supposedly misinterpreted so often that a few years later he wrote a clarification to it. He said, "By far the largest of the four categories is ignorance, and ignorance is no crime, nor is it bliss." I forget who said, "If ignorance is bliss, how come there's so much misery about it?" Anybody who thinks Joe DiMaggio was a cricketer has to be ignorant, stupid, or insane. Probably ignorant. And you wouldn't think me arrogant for saying so. It is not intolerant to remark that flat earthers are ignorant, stupid, or probably insane. It's just true. The difference is that not many people think Joe DiMaggio was a cricketer or that the earth is flat, so it isn't worth calling attention to their ignorance. But if polls are to be believed, 100 million U.S. citizens believe that humans and dinosaurs were created within the same week of each other, less than 10,000 years ago. This is more serious. People like this have the vote, and we have George W. Bush, with a little help with his friends in the Supreme Court, to prove it. They dominate school boards in some states. Their views flatly contradict the great corpus of the sciences, not just biology, but physics, geology, astronomy, and many others. It is, of course, entirely legitimate to question conventional wisdom and feels that you have bothered to mug up first. That's what Einstein did, and Galileo and Darwin. But our 100 millions are another matter. They are contradicting influential and powerfully vast fields of learning in which their own knowledge and reading is indistinguishable from zero. My arrogant and intolerant statement turns out to be nothing but simple truth. But is that truly the case? If someone denies evolution, is it safe to say that person is ignorant, or worse, stupid, insane, or wicked? When I last checked, Dawkins hadn't had any Nobel Prizes won. Yet, however, George Wald won a Nobel Prize in 1967 for his work in physiology. Before you ask, what does physiology have to do with biology and evolution? He taught biology at Harvard. Here's what he had to say in a moment of honesty. There are only two possible explanations as to how life arose: spontaneous generation arising to evolution, or a supernatural creation of God. There is no other possibility. Spontaneous generation was scientifically disproven 120 years ago by Louis Pasteur and others, but that leaves us with only one other possibility: that life came as a supernatural creation of God. But I can't accept that philosophy because I do not want to believe in God. Therefore, I choose to believe that which is scientifically impossible: spontaneous generation leading to evolution. So which is it? Is it a religious person ignorant to claim evolution is false, or is the atheist that's burying the lead because they can't accept the alternative? Before we go into that, let me make a few things clear. I will not abide by logical fallacies that are common within this debate. Logical fallacies such as the fallacy of ambiguity, the ad hominem fallacy, the genetic fallacy, the appeal to authority, or the gambler fallacy, among others. First and foremost of the logical fallacies typically utilized is the ambiguity fallacy. Whether intentional or not, evolution scientists have committed the fallacy of ambiguity by using a single word that has multiple meanings and then switching between the different definitions without clarification. Let me show you what I mean. The word evolution itself has three separate definitions, or at least three distinct and very different connotations that are used by evolutionists. One, very simply, evolution simply means change. A baby evolves as it grows. First become a toddler, then a child, an adolescent, and then an adult, growing old as a senior citizen, and then eventually dying. This definition of evolution can be used anywhere something changes, and thus, because it is so broad, does very little to actually help prove or disprove the case of evolution as far as the scientific theory goes. This denotation is not used very often within evolutionary discussions. The next two definitions are where things get dicey. The second definition of evolution can be best described as genetics. I look different than you because of our genetic makeup. There are many subspecies of dogs, and yet they are all the same species. They are dogs. They look so drastically different because of the genetic differences. If you breed two different subspecies of dogs together, you get a whole new brand of dog due to the genetic evolution. Change in the DNA. The vast majority of scientific evidence for evolution is of the genetic nature. Intelligent designers and creationists typically refer to this definition as microevolution, since it is change on the microscopic level, i.e., the DNA. The final definition is where the issue arises. No one doubts the veracity and accuracy of genetics. That is very true. One who doubts genetics would be, as Darwin starkly suggested, ignorant, stupid, or insane. However, the third definition, and the definition that has created the controversy, is what intelligent designers and creationists call macroevolution. Macroevolution is one species changing in a completely different family, order, class, or even phylum of an animal. This is the idea that man came from apes, whales came from elephants, birds came from lizards, and so on. And in fact, that all life evolved from a single-celled organism within the primordial sea. Here's where the ambiguity comes in. The cunning evolutionists used genetics, or macroevolution, as evidence proof that evolution, or macroevolution, is unquestionably true. They assume and leave the assumption unspoken that macroevolution proves and leads to macroevolution. The idea they have is that so many small changes over time led to the big changes. However, the evidence of this, as we shall soon see, is highly questionable at best, non-existent at the worst. Let me give a concrete example. A hallmark of evolution is Darwin's finches. At different locations of the Galapagos Islands, Darwin found some finches with long beaks and some finches with short beaks. He found that in areas where the food was plentiful, the beaks were generally short, while in areas where the food was more scarce, longer beaks predominated. And if one area was scarce but then became abundant with food, the short-beaked finches would soon predominate the area over the longer beaks. This is a clear example of genetics. The finches change beak size, but they never cease to be finches. However, it is touted as one of the major evidences for evolution, i.e., man came from apes. Again, let me say that no one doubts genetics. It is the leap of faith that is taken from genetics to macroevolution that is highly doubted by so many. Now, I do say so many, and the statistics over this is slightly inconsistent, depending upon the survey's definition and the way the question is worded. However, roughly 40% of Americans doubt macroevolution. And although it is claimed that religious fundamentalists are the largest and most staunch opposition to evolution, only 30% of Americans are labeled as religious fundamentalists. And out of those, only 68 are strictly creationists. While on the other hand, 66% of all conservatives oppose macroevolution compared to only 17% of liberals. And despite evolution being the scientific consensus, quote unquote, over 1,000 experts in the field have had the courage to stand up and publicly state that they have serious doubts about macroevolution. DissentFromDarwin.com is a website that has accumulated over 1,000 signatures of leading academics across the globe who doubt macroevolution. Specifically, they have signed the document stating, "We are skeptical of claims of the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwin's theory should be encouraged." To even qualify to sign this document, you have to have a doctor's degree in the scientific field of study as a bare minimum requirement. Regardless of the numbers, Darwin's finches illustrates microevolution, not macroevolution. And all too often, the similar arguments are used to prove what it cannot prove due to the use of ambiguity. However, while we are on the topic of numbers, there are a number of similar fallacies that are common in this debate that should be avoided. The bandwagon fallacy is akin to saying majority rules. Appeal to authority assumes that anything coming from an expert must therefore be trustworthy and accurate, while genetic fallacy is saying something is true or false simply because of where it came from. Underlying these three fallacies is a more blatant fallacy entitled ad hominem, which is to attack the person rather than the argument being discussed. First, let us discuss the bandwagonist fallacy for a moment. Although it is common generality to say that if most people answer a certain question with the same answer, that answer is most likely to be true, simply because the majority believes it, does not make it true. If you look at one simple subject, faith, this can be easily illustrated. According to World Population Review, there's a great many different religions around the world, and not one holds majority over the rest. Christianity claims exclusivity, meaning it has the exclusive truth in relation to metaphysical questions such as who is God. If Christianity is correct, 69% of the world is wrong. No middle ground there. Exclusivity means it is the only truth. Islam also claims exclusivity to the truth, meaning if Islam is correct, 75% of the world is wrong. Atheists believe all religions are false, and thus, if they are correct, then a whopping 84% of the world is wrong. And likewise, if any other religion is true, whether it makes exclusivity claims or not, at least the Christians, Muslims, and atheists would be wrong, because they do claim exclusivity. Which brings it up to at least 72% of the world being wrong, irrespective of what religion they choose. Which means, regarding of what is actually true, at least 69% of the world is dead wrong when it comes to their faith. Period. No way around it. This makes many people uncomfortable with questions they don't want to answer. Then who's right? Maybe no one's right. But if no one is right, then there is no hope, right? And either there is a God or there isn't. It can't be both. And there's no other option to that question. Someone has to be right. But that still makes us uncomfortable. So many people don't want to hear it. They feign ignorance and walk away, leaving the most important questions of life unanswered. Why am I here? What is my purpose? What is truly good? How do I find happiness? What is truly of note? And how can I accomplish anything of worth? And how can I know? So they just leave it unanswered, because if so many people disagree with one another, what hope is there of knowing who is right? However, this borders on upon another logical fallacy, one called personal incredulity. Personal incredulity is saying that because one finds something difficult to understand, that is therefore not true. However, simply because something is difficult to understand or incredulous does not make it false. It's incredulous to believe that light is always moving at a constant speed, even if you fly as fast as humanly possible, or even inhumanly possible. In the same direction as light, that light will still be moving away from you at the same speed, the speed of light. In fact, according to Einstein's theory of relativity, the closer you get to the speed of light, the slower time gets. Don't believe me? It's been proven. They have set two identical and very sensitive world clocks up to be at the exact same settings. One they sent up in the airplane and was shipped around the world at supersonic speeds, while the other clock remained stationary. Upon arrival back at the same location, the one that traveled at supersonic speed around the world had gained time, meaning it was behind the clock that remained stationary. Time had slowed down, even it was quite minute in its quantity, due to getting closer to the speed of light. Personal credulity is not an indicator of truth, and indecisively not making a choice is just as bad, if not worse, than merely bandwagoning it. All that to say, don't leave these questions unanswered, but don't get on the bandwagon simply because it's popular either. Majority vote does not make truth. You may have heard the phrase, might makes right, but that is only a half-truth. Might forces a particular choice to be made, one in which the one wielding the might chooses. Now, whether that choice is correct or incorrect is inconsequential to the circumstances when force is applied. Though many would argue that the topic we're discussing is science. There are no gray areas in science. It's all based on fact. There is no force or half-truths. Just plain facts. Evolution is the scientific consensus of our age. It would be foolish to disagree with it, and many experts in the field whose job it is to study these things know a lot better than we do. Well, lest we forget the quote from George Wald mentioned earlier in this video, let me give you one more illustration of the dangers of the bandwagon fallacy. Over a century ago, the prevailing scientific consensus included something called eugenics. Even before Darwin, an idea arose from the Western world that certain races were superior to other races. This was in fact widely believed. The eugenics movement was an application of that idea. Eugenics, in short, was the effort to arrange reproduction within a human population to increase the occurrences of inheritable characteristics regarded as desirable. There are in fact two types of eugenics: positive eugenics and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics attempts to promote desirable reproduction, such as encouraging the creation of families of a certain desired characteristic. Negative eugenics is the attempt, normally quite forcefully, to restrain the propagation of characteristics deemed unworthy. In case you didn't catch it within the definition, this idea is drastically demented and horrid. This idea was actually promoted and championed by many leading universities in America at the time. Perhaps Darwin's own words might be best highlighted here, for the eugenics movement was actually quite connected with the evolutionary movement. With savages, the weakened body or mind are soon eliminated. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile and the maimed and the weak. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert the utmost skill to save lives of everyone to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccinations has preserved thousands who from a weak constitution would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. Thus the weak members of our civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals would doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of men. Hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. This ideal is not merely believed, but enforced in certain sectors of our civilized society. Perfect example would be Albert Ochsner's experiments on prisoners. His thesis was entitled "The Surgical Treatment of Habitual Criminals, Imbeciles, Perverts, Paupers, Morons, Epileptics, and Degenerates," otherwise known as social undesirables. Just some of the targets of negative eugenics. What treatment was this prominent surgeon advocating? Oh, just a small little surgery to spade and neuter our social ails, as in the criminals, imbeciles, perverts, paupers, morons, epileptics, and degenerates. Shocked? Ochsner wasn't a singularity. In fact, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes ruled that a woman had to submit herself to sterilization against her will, simply because she, her mother, and her grandmother all struggle with a mental handicap. He stated, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. Now, whether you agree with Chief Justice Holmes' decision or not, over 60,000 Americans were sterilized during this movement, and many of them unknowingly so. It was the scientific consensus of the time. Race-based slavery was likewise based upon that same scientific consensus that certain characteristics, such as from being from a certain race or skin color, was superior than other races or skin colors. Science said so, and thousands merely followed the bandwagon. If you question how they could do such a thing, consider this. What bandwagon are you following? Is abortion about a choice or a life? Do you know abortion was also popularized through the eugenics movement? Yeah, they encouraged young African Americans to get abortions to be free from the shackles of a child so they could pursue their own endeavors. Oh, and through negative eugenics, discouraged the propagation of undesirables. Don't believe me? Margaret Sanger was one of the leading voices championing abortion here in America. Her program, still alive today, has mottos that include birth control to create a race of thoroughbreds, and more children from the fit, less from the unfit. She admired aspects of Nazism, and although she had nice things to say in public, such as, Negro parents, like all parents, must create the next generation from strength, not weakness, from health, not despair. While sounding supportive behind closed doors, she's directly quoted as saying the most successful education approach to the Negro is through a religious appeal. We do not want word to get out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. And the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members. Still don't believe me? Then let's look at some statistics. According to Black Dignity, abortion has killed more African Americans than diabetes, heart disease, cancer, AIDS, gang violence, and violent crimes put together. Abortion has reduced the population of African Americans by 25%. 80% of all abortion facilities are located in minority neighborhoods, and a black baby is 3 times more likely to be aborted than a white baby. In fact, there are almost as many black babies aborted as there are being born. Science used to be on Margaret Sanger's side. Now, even Planned Parenthood is attempting to strike her name out of their history due to her involvement in the eugenics movement. So much for jumping on the bandwagon of scientific consensus. Jumping onto the bandwagon is something we all must be very cautious of. We must be careful, analyze the facts, and ask ourselves, does science really say? Thus, the question we must ask going forward is the bandwagon of macroevolution worth joining? Is there truth backing that bullet train? Or did the tracks fall short? So far, we have seen through common fallacies such as ambiguity and bandwagon. But in the process, we have also seen the errors of appeal to authority, for in the very example of eugenics, we see that just because it is the scientific consensus does not mean that it is correct. Likewise, genetic fallacy is very similar and just as dangerous. The genetic fallacy says that where something comes from determines its validity. For instance, it is true that some sources are more reliable than others. Wikipedia can be edited by anyone, so its reliability as a source is negligible at best. However, to say evidence is wrong simply because of where it comes from can be just as dangerous. For instance, a Christian might bring up an objection to macroevolution, and most antagonists would proclaim their objections are illegitimate because of their faith. However, an atheist or an agnostic who has qualms with macroevolution might bring up those same exact objections, and no one would claim they are being religious. Not only is this a pure example of why genetic fallacy must be watched out for, but this also highlights one of the most blatant and most often used fallacies, the ad hominem, attacking the person rather than the argument itself. If I can discredit you as a person, then no one is going to believe what you say, no matter what evidence you provide. It is underhanded and deceitful. Even criminals on death row are capable of stating true facts. The issue is the argument being made, not the person behind the argument. The final fallacy we will look at in this video is the gambler's fallacy, but due to the specifics of that fallacy, we shall look more into it later on in the video. However, before moving on, let me make 2 final notes on logical fallacies. 1. The strawman fallacy is where one position is misrepresented so that it is easier to attack. Taking quotes out of context or playing with words to make it sound like the opponent said something or meant something that they didn't is a common and sometimes purposeful mistake made in these debates. I pray and work hard to try not to make any strawman arguments here. However, I also pray that those watching will do the same. Second, simply because something can be characterized as a fallacy does not mean the premise or the conclusion is necessarily false. It's called the fallacy fallacy. It sounds redundant, but it is actually very important. I can say the sky is blue, I am a Christian, Therefore, the square root of 16 is 4. All three statements are true, including the conclusion, but there is no logical sense to the argument. The sky being blue and me being a Christian has absolutely nothing to do with the square root of 16 being 4. It's a terrible argument. Nonetheless, all three statements are still true. Simply because a fallacy is being made does not immediately mean that it is false. At the same time, the opposite is true. Even if no fallacy is being made, it does not mean it is true. Therefore, questioning and testing all things for accuracy is a must. As we learned when we discussed the bandwagon, everything should be sifted and critically analyzed by you individually. Only you can intimate what true statements you will believe and which you will dismiss. Even then, simply because you believe it or put your faith in it, or put your trust in a truth statement, does not make it true in and of itself. So we must always be careful what true statements we believe. Now we're just about ready to look at some facts and counter facts. But before we do, let us review one more thing. Darwin's theory of evolution is simply that, a theory. However, it has been elevated to such an extent that it is promoted and fostered more strongly and adamantly than scientific law. As Dr. Michael Egnor put it, Darwinism is a trivial idea that has been elevated to the status of the scientific theory that governs modern biology. And if you don't believe Dr. Michael Egnor, just go back to what Richard Dawkins said about evolution being the central theorem of their subject. And this is a major point of contention among many skeptics of Darwinian evolution. In fact, it has been a point of much vitriol. As Louis Bernard said, evolution is a fairy tale for grown-ups. This theory helps nothing in the progress of science. It is useless. And Paul Lemoyne said the theory of evolution is impossible. At base and spirit of appearances, no one any longer believes in it. Evolution is a kind of dogma which the priests no longer believe, but which they maintain for their people. If what they say is true, why would scientists do such a thing? Well, because as David M.S. Watson says, evolution is a theory universally accepted not because it can be proven by logically coherent evidence to be true, but because the only alternative, special creation, is clearly incredible. And as we have seen, personal incredulity is not a claim for truthfulness. Here's what Wernher von Braun said about the subject. One cannot be exposed to the law and order of the universe without concluding that there must be design and purpose behind it all. The better we understand the intricacies of the universe and all it harbors, the more reason we have found to marvel at the inherent design upon which it is based. To be forced to believe only one conclusion, that everything in the universe happened by chance, would violate the very objectivity of science itself. What random process could produce the brain of a man or the system of the human eye? They challenge science to prove the existence of a designer. But must we really light a candle to see the sun? They say they cannot visualize a designer. Well, can a physicist visualize an electron? What strange rationale makes some physicists accept the inconceivable electron as real while refusing to accept the reality of a designer on the grounds they cannot conceive him? It is in scientific honesty that I endorse the presentation of alternative theories for the origins of the universe, life, and man in the science classroom. It would be an error to overlook the possibility that the universe was planned rather than happening by chance. Such controversy over being a theory. As a quick reminder, scientific theory is a coherent group of propositions formulated to explain a group of facts or phenomena in the natural world and repeatedly confirmed through experiment or observation. While a scientific law is a statement that describes an observed occurrence in nature that appears to always be true. Generally, the biggest difference between a scientific theory and scientific law is the level of evidence supporting it. So let us look at the evidence of the so-called theory of evolution, in particular, the components of macroevolution. Perhaps the most commonly heard source of evidence for evolution is the fossil record. So let us hear from the foremost expert and what he had to say about the evidence that the fossil record should hold. Charles Darwin, author of the very theory we discuss, in his book The Origin of Species, little known, also named The Preservation of Favored Races and the Struggle for Life, a racist title if I ever heard it, said in no uncertain terms that an indeterminate number of intermediate forms must have existed, linking together all the species in each group of gradations. This remains true today. Remember, the massive assumption evolution makes is that microevolution proves macroevolution, that over thousands of years, one small change at a time, life evolved from a single-celled organism to all the millions of animal species we have today. Therefore, the assumption is that the intermediate forms, as Darwin put it, should be evident in the fossil record. However, the fossil record stumped Darwin. In his own words, he said, "The abrupt manner in which whole groups of species suddenly appears in certain formations has been urged by several paleontologists as a fatal objection to the belief in the transmutation of species, i.e. evolution. There is another allied difficulty which is much more serious. I allude to the manner in which many species in several of many divisions of the animal kingdom suddenly appear in the fossiliferous rocks. To the question why we did not find rich fossiliferous deposits belonging to these assumed earliest periods, I could give no satisfactory answer. The first dilemma with the fossil record he found was that certain species seemed to suddenly appear in the fossil record across the world in different locations, seemingly at the same time. However, for Darwin's theory to work, specific environmental confines are required for evolution to occur, namely a fight for survival. Example, using his finches again, a food shortage on a certain island causes the finch's beaks to grow in length, if you forgive the anthropomorphism. However, a problem occurs when suggesting that a worldwide event occurred causing a species to evolve in different locations all across the globe in the same manner. The second dilemma is commonly known as the Cambrian explosion. Darwin's theory postulated that all species evolved from a single progenitor, or ancestor. That one species evolved into more and more variants as time went on, branching out into all the different classes and phyla that we know and are familiar with today. Instead, what we find with the Cambrian explosion is that all the familiar classes and phyla that we know of today appear suddenly and inexplicably during the Cambrian explosion. Fish, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, birds, etc. They appear fully formed and leave the fossil record, if extinct, fully formed. For millions of species, there should be logically millions more intermediate forms or missing links, as they are sometimes called today. Why call them missing links? Because they are for the most part missing from the fossil record. The Precambrian layer, as mentioned by Darwin, should, per his theory, hold innumerable fossils, and indeed, he stated in his book that the fossil record of his day was incomplete and that such fossils could be found in the future. Over a century later, the pattern in the fossil record remains nearly identical to what it was in Darwin's day. We know more and have dug up more, yes, but these issues still remain. The Precambrian layer is void of transitional forms, even though it is prime real estate for fossilization. In fact, Darwin hypothesized that perhaps some of the transitional forms are so small that they avoided fossilization of the Precambrian layer. Unfortunately, due to the rich fossilization capability of the Precambrian layer, not only do we know this to be false, but we have found fossils of protozoa, or single-celled organisms like bacteria, in the Precambrian layer. If bacteria can leave a fossil, where are the rest of these intermediate forms? Many scientists argue that we have found hundreds, if not thousands, of intermediate fossils. However, in my search, at most less than a dozen are cited. Regardless, so far, there has not been one missing link that has escaped harsh rebuttal, controversy, and unresolved dispute. Let me give you some examples. Bolinia is touted as a missing link for the giraffe's long neck, yet arrives in the fossil record fully formed and disappears fully formed. Debate is over whether it is not merely a different species of giraffe, one that many evolutionists agree was a dead-end species, meaning it was not an ancestor of the giraffe and was not a missing link. Moerithrium was supposedly an amphibious mammal that looked like a hippo with its lips supposedly fused to its nostril. It is touted as a missing link to the elephant. However, it has none of the shared characteristics of the elephant to support that claim. No trunk, no tusk, no size, or perhaps the most characteristic, specialized weight-bearing joints. Aside from the human-ape link, the Archaeopteryx is perhaps the most well-known and quoted missing link between birds and reptiles. However, even this is controversial. The very same reptilian teeth and wings can be found in modern-day birds today. However, these modern-day birds are species of birds, not reptiles. Simply because they have similar characteristics does not make them family or ancestors. Birds do tend to have no teeth, yet some reptiles have no teeth either. That does not make them birds as well. Marsupials lay eggs. That does not make them birds either. Regardless, even if this is granted to the evolution as a potential missing link, it appears in the fossil record fully formed and disappears from the record fully formed. Perhaps the best case for looking at the controversy of missing links is a gaze at the debauchery in cases supporting missing links from man to ape. Indeed, there have been many claims to the search for missing links. Rampithecus, Piltdown Man, Nebraska Man, Java Man, Neanderthals, Australopithecus afarensis, and more recently, Sahelanthropus. Unfortunately, Rampithecus ended up being the equivalent of a modern orangutan. Piltdown Man was a jawbone of a modern ape, a few teeth, and a human skull treated with chemicals to age it, then buried in the ground, planted to be discovered. Nebraska Man was a pig's tooth. Java Man was originally found with two other skulls found in the same area in the same region. The other two skulls were hidden and kept secret for nearly 30 years, both of which were unquestionably fully human, and Java Man ended up being nothing more than a large gibbon. Not a link at all. Neanderthals are now controversially classified as Homo sapien, or fully human, and Lucy and her kind did not walk upright as they claimed at first, were not intermediates between species, and were most likely not of human ancestry at all. Finally, Sahelanthropus had gorilla-like attributes, was not bipedal, and belonged more to the ape family than any transitional postulations toward humanity. How often do we heed the boy who cried wolf before we come to our senses? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Fool me thrice. In the end, a dog is still a dog, whether it is a Chihuahua or a Great Dane. No record exists that depicts transitions at the class level or higher at the most generous. Let me express this a little stronger. Some scientists cling to many of these debatable and sometimes outrageous frauds as missing links. As an example of the classification issue, let us look again at Neanderthals. It is said that scientists can unequivocally identify a fossil as a Neanderthal by certain characteristics of the fossil remains. Characteristics such as a longer lower skull, a wider pelvis, and even the size of its ear bones. Now, let me give you a current day example of how such characteristic variations can be dangerous. Pygmies are generally as short as dwarves, but not considered dwarves because their limbs grow proportionally to their height. Pygmies, dwarves, and giants are considered Homo sapiens. However, they each have very distinct skeletal characteristics. If a fossil remain was found of a pygmy, how would scientists be differentiated between a Homo sapien and a potential missing link, such as the supposed Homo floresiensis? Caricatures always tend to draw hair on their face and provide an ape-like appeal to it. However, no bone structure can accurately portray location of hair follicles. It's almost laughable. Although there's a great deal of genetics involved in why some people are born dwarves or giants, there are many cases in which you may have a normal-sized parent and yet grow to be a dwarf or a giant. In fact, many such cases are blamed upon what is categorized as disorders. So far from being a positive evolutionary change, this would be a negative outcome that would potentially be eliminated by survival of the fittest. Dwarfism can be caused by pituitary dwarfism and achondroplasia, while giantism can be caused by pituitary gigantism and acromegalia. Consider other conditions and characteristics of humans around the world that might have distinct yet specific characteristics that could classify them as something other than Homo sapiens if the only thing we had to go on was their fossilized remains. Let's look at the neck. It's just a small part of the body, but evolutionists believe it to be a pivotal development, no pun intended, that allowed human brain to develop as it did. So let us look at some interesting neck developments. The Kayan tribe in northern Thailand, southern Myanmar, have the longest necks in the world. Why? Well, their women wear long iron bands around their necks. Many, many bands. Their necks can grow over 7 inches long. That's from chin to collarbone. The average human neck is only about 4 inches. Then there are those who have very short necks. In fact, a congenital disorder called Klippel-Feil syndrome fuses vertebrae together in an irregular manner to which it seems that the child has little or no neck. Other extreme examples exist. Consider the ancient Chinese tradition of binding little girls' feet, or how about those who were born with 6 fingers or with double joints, etc. These oddities and strange skeletal variances do not make those who have them any more or less human. However, the size of someone's hips and head can clearly be classified as a Neanderthal. Please do not hear me wrong. My argument here is not that there are no intermediate forms or missing links. As I've stated, there are many fossils out there that have been labeled missing links and intermediate forms. My argument is not even that every single one of them is debatable and controversial. My argument is that we should have hundreds, thousands, if not millions of them. There should be no doubt if macroevolution is indeed true. It should be abundantly evident. My argument is, it's not. Let me give some other issues with the process of evolution here. There are few examples scientists love to use to prove evolution, a feat they take great pride in, and that is man-made or man-induced evolution of the species. Please don't hear me wrong. I am not disparaging the great scientific feat of what they have done in cases such as the creation of the four-winged fruit fly. However, the ambiguity fallacy and the strawman fallacy is rampant in this discussion and debate over the implications of this accomplishment. Scientists have found that by altering a certain gene, the fruit fly, which normally has 2 wings, will sprout a second set of wings. However, there are a few things that should be mentioned about this feat. Scientists did not manipulate the fruit fly to create a new set of wings. Instead, they manipulated something the fruit flies already had, something called an halter, or sometimes called a modified wing, and by that, the fruit fly grew the extra pair of wings. By removing a certain gene called the Hox gene from the lower thorax, scientists discovered that the fruit fly will grow a second set of wings instead of the halter. This is a great discovery for the field of genetics and the process of gene manipulation. In regards of proving macroevolution, however, there are a multiplicitous series of problems. Perhaps the first point of contention is the most obvious. The fruit fly is still fruit fly, whether it has 2 wings or 4 wings. In fact, as far as genetic categorization goes, it would be a very difficult argument to say that the 4-winged fruit fly is even a different subspecies from the original 2-winged fruit fly. Second, the 4-winged fruit fly can't fly. Although it is true that the halter vibrated and helped orient the fruit fly in flight, it is not so simple a problem as not having that stabilizer. Removing the Hox gene and growing 2 extra wings provided an added issue because the muscles to control the wing did not, quote-unquote, evolve with the new set of wings. In fact, scientists have looked into what it would take, and multiple gene alterations would have to occur for the muscles to grow in tandem with the wing. That means that approximately at least 3 or more genetic changes had to occur at the same time for a 4-winged fruit fly to be able to fly with 4 wings. And it would have to be able to fly to survive outside of the laboratory and survival of the fittest. Michael Behe is famous for an argument he has made against macroevolution called irreducible complexity. This is a perfect example of that. You cannot reduce the system any further. You would have to have both, otherwise the system will not work. Therefore, you would have to have all of those systems evolve at the same time, which causes Darwinian theory to fall apart. Because as Darwin himself said, and many evolutionists claim, Macroevolution came from micro changes, one micro change at a time over eons. However, this is an example of how that cannot work. So instead of the natural benefit of Haldare, the new wings end up being dead weight and an added hindrance. This is something the evolutionists readily concede. In fact, the National Center for Science Education, which, despite the name, is not a government agency, but a private nonprofit organization out of California that has been called the leading anti-creationist organization in the United States. Not quite the neutral party here, but they stated that the four-winged fruit fly is a classic example of how creationists misinterpret the genetic analysis of development. Developmental geneticists try to understand the role of a gene by modifying a gene and analyzing consequences. So it is of little consequence that four-winged fruit flies will not survive in the wild. So they readily admit the four-winged fruit fly would not survive in the wild. And at the same time, they provide a, forgive me for borrowing the phrase, a classic example of how not only the ambiguity fallacy, but also the strawman fallacy is used in these debates. Ambiguity in that here we are suddenly talking about genetics, genetic research, and genetic breakthroughs, not macroevolution. The quote also provides a strawman fallacy, for it says that creationists misinterpreted the genetic analysis of development. However, it's not the genetics that the creationists balk at. It is the attempt by many evolutionists to tout the four-winged fruit fly as proof of macroevolution. But it is easy to see where the confusion can come in. For when evolution is talked about, the distinction between genetics and macroevolution is rarely, ever considered. Many other examples exist of genetic mutation alterations or changes that are touted as proof of evolution, like antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Again, the argument is not that these changes are irrelevant or inconsequential. The argument is that these examples do not in any way prove macroevolution. A popular argument for how genetics proves macroevolution is something called homology. The definition, according to Oxford, is the state of having the same or similar relations, relative position, or structure. The way it works is if different creatures develop similar structures in similar ways, then it makes sense that they are ancestrally connected, or so the thought goes. Unfortunately, this logic is just about as loose as saying that all vehicles have similar structures, and thus must have been made by the same company. Any reputable car connoisseur would agree that conclusion is laughable. Despite the poor logic, as the premise does not necessarily lead to the conclusion, there are many homologous structures in nature that scientists can readily point to, and some they readily fabricate, whether that be knowingly or unknowingly so. Hagel's embryos is perhaps the most famous and well-known example of homology, and is found in most textbooks even today. It is now known, if perhaps not widely known, that Hegel not only cherry-picked the embryos that looked the most alike, ignoring all those that did not, but also skipped certain stages to best match the patterns and smudged pictures to curtail the diagram to his own liking. Most of the images are of mid-level embryo development, not early development, as was touted and included as an important factor for the evidence. But don't take my word on this. It was Stephen Jay Gould who said Hegel had exaggerated the similarities by idealizations and omissions. He also, in some cases, in a procedure that can only be called fraudulent, simply copied the same figure over and over. And yet, despite Gould's whistleblowing over a decade ago, Hegel's embryos are still widely used in textbooks and taught in schools across the country. However, Hegel's embryos certainly isn't the only example textbooks use of homology. Although very similar in this diagram, many textbooks have a diagram comparing a human arm, a whale fin, and a bat's wing, drawn to show distinct similarities. The issue with this form of homology is that for homology to truly depict anything relatively supportive of macroevolution, it would need to be proven that homologous structures develop in much the same way, both through the same gene and within the same area and stages of development. The evidence here is indeed two-sided. There are, in fact, examples where homologous structures are proven to be derived from the same genes and are developed in the same manner in different animals. However, this is not universally true. For instance, the homologous body structures of the fruit fly and the wasp stem from different genes, and the homologous gut structures of certain animals, like the shark, lamprey, and the frog, develop differently in the embryonic cavity. The shark's gut develops at the top of the cavity, the lamprey at the bottom, and the frog in the bottom and top regions, even though they are touted as homologous structures. Some would argue that these are not homologous structures at all, but analogous structures. Similar to how they would say the structure of a bee's wing is similar to the structure of a bird's wing. And yet the bee is not, as they would say, in any way a close evolutionary relationship to birds. Analogous structures, as they would define it, is when similar physical features occur in organisms because of environmental constraints and not due to a close evolutionary relationship. Like when a platypus lays eggs and is similar to birds, reptiles, and amphibians, and has similar appendage structures as reptiles. That does not make the platypus a bird, reptile, or amphibian. This, however, is a bit self-fulfilling. How do they know when a structure is analogous and when it is homologous? Why, quite easily, by the preconceived notion of the evolutionary tree of ancestry. If two animals have similar structures but are not related to another, in our preconceived notion of evolution, the structures are analogous. If they are related to one another, then they're homologous. Simple trick, no? It assumes evolution to be true, as is understandable. However, if evolution is not true, such categorization should not fool us into thinking it adds any validity to the claim. Plus, the frog, the lamprey, and the shark are very closely related to each other in their scheme of the tree of life, not like the bee and the bird. Calling the lamprey, shark, and frog gut analogous should be quite the stretch on their own terms. Remember, they called a bat's wing and a human's arm homologous. Please listen closely to what I'm saying. I'm not saying that there are no similar structures within different animals that develop comparatively and are controlled by identical genes. What I am saying is it does not prove ancestry or macroevolution. Not only that, but even with proper examples, there are ample counterexamples to go with it, even if the argument of poor logic is ignored. Poor logic, for if I find a good strategy for solving a problem, simply because someone else discovers this strategy as well does not mean that person stole or copied that strategy from me. In a similar fashion, simply because a structure is optimal for certain living organisms does not mean those organisms are in any way related to one another. Let me give you one more concrete example, one that many evolutionists love to point out for their own gain, and that is the great similarities in genetic makeup. Living organisms have great similarities within their genetics. This evolutionists love to point out, for chimpanzee DNA is 98.8% identical to our own DNA. At first, this sounds like an amazing point that should remove a great amount of doubt about common ancestry and homology. However, there are a few other things that should be considered in tandem with this amazing statistic. One, if you consider how different humans look and act from each other, that difference is made from at most 1/100th of 1% difference in our DNA. Let me say that again. About 99.99% of all human DNA with every single other human being on the planet is the same. If such an infinitesimally small percentage is culpable for the vast differences among humans, should we not be wary of the great divide that even 2% can make? Mathematically, let me just add that 2% is 200 times larger than 1/100th of a percent. Second, let us ponder some more shocking statistics. Humans are actually matched closer to pigs than we are to orangutans, even though orangutans are primates, and that by 2%. While the differences in DNA between a pig and a chimpanzee, and compared to our own, is only about 0.8%. In fact, there have been radical theories proposing that humans developed when pigs and chimpanzees mated. However, before you freak out and perhaps buy into the theory that man evolved from pig and ape, which some professional scientists have suggested, don't forget the power of a mere 1/100th of a percent. Here are a few more shocking statistics that may bring some stark interest in the power of just a few percentage points difference. Our DNA is 90% identical to cats, 85% identical to mice, 84% identical to dogs. With zebrafish, we have 73% identical. And slugs, 70%. Chickens, 65%. And 60% like a banana. What? Yeah, that's right. 60% of our DNA is identical to a banana. And then finally, our DNA is identical to botanical trees by 50% of our DNA. Again, please don't take this argument the wrong way. I do not wish to diminish the importance of DNA research. In fact, I believe that many evolutionists underestimate the power of DNA, not overestimate it. True, chimpanzees are very close in comparison to our DNA. However, no matter how close they are, that difference is still astronomically large. Consider how much raw information is found within a single gram of DNA. 1 gram, or about 0.03 of an ounce, can hold around 215 million gigabytes. That's akin to the total memory sum of about 18 million laptops. If you consider how much data you can store on a computer, that's a lot of data. And even 2% of that is astronomically large amount. Don't you think? So again, I am not saying humans and chimpanzees don't have a lot in common genetically. What I am saying is, even if it is a 1.8% genetic difference, that 1.8% genetic difference is astronomically vast and wide. So far, all I have done is raise questions about supposed proof of truth of macroevolution. If that was all I had against it, I would not have bothered debating its merit. However, the support of evidence is not the only issue I find with macroevolution. There are at least 2 scientific mathematical laws that either contradict or flat out conflict with macroevolution. Borel's single law of chance and the second law of thermodynamics. Let us discuss the second law of dynamics first. There are 2 parts of this law I wish to discuss. First, the principle, and then the application. Most directly, the second law of thermodynamics says that within a closed system, entropy will always increase. Some good examples would be a room left alone will become dirty, metal will erode in open air and by water, a hot coffee cup will eventually return to room temperature, friction halts the motion of a moving object. This seems rather contradictory, seeing as evolution states that life evolved from the simplest celled organism to the highest advanced and complex creatures such as dolphins, elephants, chimpanzees, and humans. However, the opposing argument is that although the universe is a closed system, the Earth is not. For instance, a plant grows due to the power it receives from the sunlight. The sun is outside the system of the plant, and thus that plant is not a closed system. Energy flows into it from outside itself. Thus, in that way, it is easily feasible to see the Earth as an open system, even though the universe may be a closed system. Still, the complexity of life is an issue for macroevolution. Here's an application. Macromolecules, such as DNA, RNA, and even the more basic proteins, the building blocks of life, are created by amino acids. You can consider them the ingredients used to make the building blocks of life. However, even if the existence of amino acids are predeterminedly given, there is a thermodynamic barrier to the spontaneous creation of macromolecules, which is necessary for evolutionary theory of origins to work. In simpler terms, a protein, a very specific arrangement of amino acids that only exists if each amino acid is of the correct kind and in the correct order. However, due to the second law of thermodynamics, if all the correct ingredients were there for a protein to exist, anywhere around 40 to over 1,200 amino acids of 20 different kinds, and even if they are lined up exactly correct, it would still not create the protein. The thermodynamic barrier keeps it from doing so. Extra energy must be exerted for the amino acid to consolidate into a protein, We will discuss probability here soon. However, it is worth noting that the probability of a series of amino acids spontaneously breaking through and creating a protein is so astronomically high, it has been compared to the chances of a newborn baby climbing up the 3,000-foot sheer cliff face of El Capitan in Yosemite Valley. Or, basically, nil. Over and above that, just the premise of that issue is astronomical. Let me explain. There are over 20 different kinds of amino acids. However, a protein is a long and very specific recipe of amino acids. So let us take a glance at the probability of a protein somewhere between the two extremes. Let us look at the probability of an unlimited amount of amino acids combining together to form one protein with a recipe of 400 amino acids. FYI, that means 400 amino acids have to come together in precise and exact order. With 400 amino acids of 20 different kinds, there are 2 decillion, 788 nonillion, 360 octillion, 984 septillion different combinations. FYI, in case you have no idea what those numbers are, it goes millions, billions, trillions, quadrillions, quintillions, sextillions, septillions, octillions, and then there is nontillion and finally decillion. Anyway, 2.7 decillion combinations are possible between 400 amino acids of 20 different kinds. As we are looking for one single combination among those possibilities, the chances of that one protein ever lining up correctly is approximately 1 chance in 10 to the 260th power. To put that perspective, that is this number. Professor Tony Padilla estimated the number of particles in the observed universe using data from the Planck Space Telescope and came up with a general number that many agree is the general sum of particles in the universe observed thus far by man. Now consider that 5 trillion hydrogen atoms can fit on the head of a single pin. The number of particles in the known universe must be quite impressive. Even more impressive when you consider that one hydrogen atom has multiple particles, as in electrons, protons, and neutrons. Padilla's number is 3.28 times 10 to the 80th power. Or in case you're wondering, that number right there. If Padilla's calculations are correct, then let me give you a little analogy as the probability of 400 amino acids lining up just perfectly to create just one protein. Oh, and at that, disregarding the thermodynamic barrier for the moment. 400 amino acids of 20 different kinds lining up just right is akin to filling the known universe with little blue marbles, completely filled with the exception of one single sole red marble. Okay? The likelihood of someone being blindfolded, shot up into space to pick just one single marble and picking that one red marble 3 times in a row is the same chance as one protein, a 400 amino acid chain coming into chance. In fact, that scenario is actually lacking in equality, for a marble is quite large compared to a single molecule, no less a single particle. And yet, for evolution to work, not only does this have to happen, but it must happen hundreds of thousands of times, if not more. And that is without considering the issue of the thermodynamic barrier, which compounds the issue exponentially more than it already is. And all this is just the start of the issue with life starting spontaneously. Now, to connect this with the next issue, Borel's law of probability states that infinitesimally small probabilities are practically equal to 0, meaning they never happen. Now, many evolutionists balk at this argument because any probability higher than 0 is still technically possible, no matter how improbable. However, here is the problem. Where, when, and do we ever round down? If the probability is 0.100th, well, that is quite possible. That's akin to 1% chance. Even this has been known to occur in even smaller changes. However, what about numbers that we have looked at above? What about this number? A general number that Borel gave, and many experts generally agree as the cutoff for what is possible, is 1 times 10 to the 50th. So according to this, any statistic higher than this is so improbable it should be considered impossible. But still, evolutionists hate and tend to disregard this issue quite easily. However, I have found that most of the time, they fall victim to the gambler's fallacy. There are two types of probability when considering the chance of something occurring: dependent events and independent events. For example, an independent event would be like rolling the dice. Even if you roll that die a second time, the first throw does not affect the second roll. You have a 1/6 chance of rolling any one number on the first throw, and a 1/6 chance of rolling any one number on the second throw. They are independent of each other. However, if I have 6 yellow and 4 blue marbles in a bag, and I take one blue marble out and do not place it back in the bag, the quantity of what's in the bag changes. If I take a second marble out after that, the probability of pulling any one color has now changed from before, for there is one less marble in the bag. That is a dependent event, for the probability of the second pull depends on what I pull out the first time. Evolutionists are quite famous for saying that given enough time, even astronomically small probabilities are possible. Some even go as far as proposing theories such as the multiverse. In fact, in a scathing article bashing the supposed intelligence of intelligent design and creationist supporters, the National Center for Science Education, again, remember, the nonprofit organization, not the government agency in the least, said this: suppose that a monkey, trained to hit the keys of a typewriter one by one in a truly random fashion, types forever, producing infinitely many pages of text. No one doubts that the monkey would type page after page of gibberish, but it follows from the above principle that sooner or later the monkey would type all the works of Shakespeare from beginning to end without error, solely by accident. Incredibly, there was no doubt that a monkey hitting random keys could somehow type the entire work of Shakespeare. Such a belief would posit that it is in fact possible to place all the parts of a pocket watch inside a box separately, and then by shaking the box for an eternity would eventually reveal a complete, fully functioning pocket watch. If that be the case, perhaps we could theorize that ancient carvings were the random works of wind and water decaying in such a way as to create the illusion of what we see as drawings. I'm sorry, but I seriously doubt any right-minded archaeologist would consider such a theory for more than a millisecond longer than it takes to hear and comprehend it. The problem with such thinking has to do with dependent and independent events. It is preposterous. Every time the monkey hits a key, that was an independent event. The chances of the monkey forming even one word does not diminish the longer it types. It remains the same, for each key pushed is a truly random, independent event. That never changes the probability of the next letter being pushed. Ever. Sadly, the author of that article even made the comparison to the very low probability of a person getting struck by lightning. And yet people get hit by lightning. It happens. And he used this as an equal comparison of how extremely unlikely probabilities are possible. Well, the probability of lightning hitting a person within their lifetime, assuming an 80-year lifespan, is around 5 times 10 to the 5th power. Well, let me say again, Borel's law states that any number higher than 3 times 10 to the 50th power is impossible. When comparing these two numbers, the power of exponents becomes unfathomable to the human mind. It's just numbers on a page, so let me put it into perspective. 1 times 10 to the 5th power goes into 1 times 10 to the 10th power 1 times 10 to the 5th times, meaning it takes 10,000 10,000s just to get 1 times 10 to the 10th power. You would need another 10,000s of those just to reach 1 times 10 to the 50th power. Are we thinking the probability of lightning hitting is a fair comparison here? I sure hope not. Now let me show you further why there's a problem with the logic. With enough time, it is bound to happen. Like the lottery, someone is bound to win. That, however, is using the logic of dependent events. The lottery is a dependent event. There are only so many lottery tickets, and one is the winner. That one winning lottery ticket will go out. The probability of someone getting it is dependent upon how many losing lottery tickets have already been given out, even if that probability is left unknown to the public. And rightfully so. Lotteries would lose money if they provided that data. Random probability is not and never will be dependent, even if you are to claim the universe is a closed system. Please consider this carefully. Just because I flip a coin and got heads, the probability that my second flip of the coin is tails is no more and no less than 50%. The same probability I had of flipping a heads the first time. Even if I flip a coin for all eternity, the probability that my next flip of the coin is heads or tails will always remain the same, no matter what. 50-50. Time is irrespective of independent events, and 1 times 10 to the 50th power is an astronomically unfathomable, enormous number. Yet the probability we have seen for even just one protein spontaneously aligning itself is exponentially higher than that. The numbers just don't add up. Let me put one more pin in this issue, one that comes from one of their own, Sir Fred Hoyle, an atheist evolutionist. He set about to determine the probability of life arising spontaneously. He made several very generous assumptions, such as that all the raw materials, the amino acids, necessary for life was present and readily available, and even that a mechanism was present that allowed for the creation of macromolecules across the thermodynamic barrier. Hoyle worked under the assumption that the most basic organic cell has about 200,000 proteins in it. Since Hoyle did his experiment, however, we have learned that there are actually 42 million proteins in a simple cell. However, since it's what Hoyle used for his equation, let us look at the probability in tandem with the assumption that 200,000 proteins are needed. All right? Hoyle came up with the probability that life spontaneously evolved, given all the incredibly precise and complex prerequisites, as 1 times 10 to the 40,000. That is so far above and beyond any number we've seen so far. So, to sort of put it in any kind of perspective, that number is ridiculously huge. There should be no doubt that this number is past the point where it should be even considered as anything other than zero. In fact, Hoyle went further and supposed that even if every star out there had a planet like Earth, which it doesn't, but even if it did, if every star out there had a planet like Earth capable of producing life, he repeated the statistical analysis and came up with the same answer for all intents and purposes. Fundamentally, zero chance. Sir Fred Hoyle came up with an analogy to put this astronomical number in perspective. It would be something like a tornado going through a junkyard and creating a fully functioning, fully upholstered Boeing 747 in working order, ready to take off. Even if the junkyard was the size of the universe, this would not be possible. And this was Sir Fred Hoyle's conclusion as well. And many famous evolutionists tend to come to this conclusion as well. At least, that life could not have arisen by chance on Earth. The evidence just doesn't support it. But because they can't accept the alternative, they also tend to turn to radical, rather unscientific theories. Some, like Stephen Jay Gould, suggested at one time, perhaps going back to the idea of a discredited scientist by the name of Goldschmidt and his hopeful monsters, that miracles, such as a rabbit hatching from a chicken's egg, happens every once in a millennia. Some, like Jean Piaget, at one time suggested going back to Lamarckianism, a discredited evolutionary scientist who took anthropomorphizing nature to the extreme. But a large number turned to panspermia, or the idea that life originated from outer space. But the belief in panspermia did not always devolve into belief in aliens, though sometimes it did. In fact, Sir Fred Hoyle and a scientist close to him, Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe, suggested that life came by falling comets and asteroids. Even more, aspire to the great multiverse. The idea that there's a gigantic cosmic die of possibilities, and our universe just happened to be the one where all possibilities for life to exist aligned perfectly, while the literal thousands of millions of other universes marked out the failures. Again, this confuses dependent events with independent events, blurring the lines between them and tying them in with a scientific fiction fantasy. The multiverse works well for Marvel comics like Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, but it is a far cry from scientifically defensible here in reality. Well, outside of faith, that is. But that's typically a bad word among the science community. Richard Lewontin said, "We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdities of some of its constructs, in spite of its failures to fulfill many of the extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community of unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." This quote perfectly illustrates how many scientists have been able to ignore much of what I discussed here, because they cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Macroevolution is broken and bankrupt ideal, supported and vehemently defended, not because of the veracity of its components, but because of its practical application of removing God from the equation. Although there is much more I could say on the subject, I will reserve that for another time and hope you will join me next time when I delve into intelligent design and provide reasons for why I believe God truly does exist, that He created me and you, and that our value, as discussed in the first video in this series, is derived not from chance, which leaves us as subjectively valueless, void, and pointless cosmic mistakes, to beings designed and loved by one who intentionally, intricately, and intimately created us with value and purpose.